Story number 1.
The day had been long and exhausting. I was flying home from a business trip in Seattle to my small hometown in the Midwest, a journey I had made countless times before. The flight was late in the evening, and I had a layover at Chicago O'Hare, a massive, bustling airport I had always found a bit overwhelming. But this time, something was different. I arrived at O'Hare just after midnight. The airport was quieter than usual, but still alive with the hum of travelers and staff moving around the endless corridors. I grabbed a coffee and settled near my gate, waiting for the boarding call to my connecting flight. The terminal was one of those older parts of the airport with high ceilings and long stretches of seating under flickering fluorescent lights. After about an hour, the gate agent announced a delay. The connecting flight wouldn't depart for at least 2 hours. Most of the passengers groaned but resigned themselves to waiting. I was tired, but I knew I'd have to stick it out. To pass the time, I wandered around the terminal, checking out shops and kiosks still open. At about 2 a.m., I found myself near a quieter area of the terminal, a section mostly shut down with darkened storefronts and empty seating. The air was colder there, and the usual buzz of conversation and footsteps was muted. A few travelers had fallen asleep on the benches, heads resting on backpacks or the metal armrests. I sat down on one of the benches to rest my eyes, feeling the fatigue settle deep into my bones. That's when I noticed the unusual silence. It was so complete that it felt unnatural, like the hum of the airport had just stopped. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered once, then again, before settling into a steady but dim glow. A cold draft swept through the terminal, making the papers on the nearby floor ripple. I looked around but saw nothing out of place. Then I heard it. A faint sound coming from the end of the terminal. At first, I thought it was just the echo of footsteps, but they were too soft and too slow to belong to any of the few people around. It sounded like someone dragging their feet. I stood up, curious and a little uneasy. The terminal was mostly empty now. The shops were closed, the gates silent. I followed the sound toward a part of the terminal I hadn't noticed before. A narrow corridor leading to a closed-off gate labeled A13. The gate was cordoned off with yellow caution tape. A small sign said it was under renovation. No flights in or out. Strange, I thought. This gate wasn't on my itinerary or anyone's. No announcements had ever mentioned it. I looked down the dark corridor. The dragging footsteps sound was coming from inside. My heart started to race. Then I saw movement, a shadow flickering just beyond the light's reach. The shadow moved slowly, almost gliding, not quite touching the floor. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. I stepped forward, drawn despite myself. Suddenly, the shadow stopped and turned sharply toward me. In the dim light, I saw the shape of a man wearing an old-fashioned pilot's uniform, his eyes hollow and glowing faintly red. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a cold, unnatural silence. I took a step back and tripped over something soft. Looking down, I saw a pile of old luggage tags, worn and faded, all bearing dates from the 1940s and 1950s. The names on them were unfamiliar, but each tag had the same symbol, a small black wing. The pilot figure reached toward me with a translucent hand. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and ran toward the main terminal. As I rushed through the terminal, the usual airport sounds returned. Announcements, chatter, rolling suitcases, but everything felt off. Faces around me seemed blurred, like shadows with no distinct features. People passed through me without noticing. I reached a set of automatic doors that led to the arrivals area, hoping to find security or at least someone who could explain what I had just seen. But when I stepped outside, the night air was thick and heavy, like I was breathing through water. The airport lights were gone, replaced by an endless black fog that swallowed the runway and terminal buildings. From within the fog, I heard distant voices, whispers calling my name in a language I didn't understand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Panic overwhelmed me. I forced myself back inside, slamming the doors shut behind me. The terminal was quiet again, empty except for the soft humming of the ventilation system. The flickering lights steadied. I checked my phone. No signal, no time displayed. It was as if my device had been shut down. I ran back to the gate where I'd started, but the caution tape was gone. The gate was open and bustling with passengers boarding a plane. I approached a flight attendant and asked if there was a flight to my hometown. She smiled politely and said, "Yes, you're on the next one." I showed her my boarding pass, but the gate number was different now, and the plane was scheduled to depart in 5 minutes. I boarded the plane, my hands shaking. The flight felt unreal, silent except for the steady hum of the engines. When we landed, my phone buzzed with messages from friends and family asking if I was okay. Time had passed as normal outside, but inside that airport, something had shifted. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or experienced that night at O'Hare. Some nights, when I close my eyes, I still hear the slow, dragging footsteps coming from gate A13, calling me back into the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The night shift at the airport was never something I enjoyed, but it was a necessary evil during my years as a freelance photographer. That night, in early November, I had just finished a late shoot in New York and was making my way home, connecting through Chicago O'Hare. My layover was 5 hours long, enough time to get dinner, nap, and maybe catch up on some work emails. The airport was already starting to empty as the last red-eye flights took off, and the crowds thinned to a handful of tired business travelers and insomniacs like me. I settled in near gate C19, the departure point for a flight to Denver scheduled to leave at 3:15 a.m. The chairs were mostly empty, and the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow over the otherwise silent terminal. I plugged in my headphones and tried to zone out, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. About an hour later, I noticed an older man sitting a few seats away, dressed in a rumpled gray suit that looked like it belonged to another era. He wasn't on his phone or reading, just staring straight ahead with an expression that felt empty, like he was waiting for something that would never come. I tried not to stare, but there was something unsettling about him. His eyes had a glazed-over quality, and his hands rested loosely on his knees, twitching slightly. The PA system crackled to life, announcing an incoming flight from Los Angeles followed by boarding calls and gate changes. The normal hum of activity continued, but the man didn't flinch or look away. Then, about 15 minutes later, the lights flickered briefly. Nothing major, just a quick pulse, but enough to catch my attention. The man blinked once, slowly, and then turned his head toward me. His gaze was fixed, and in it, I felt an unmistakable coldness, like he wasn't really there. I shifted uncomfortably and decided to get up and walk around, maybe stretch my legs. I wandered down the terminal toward the food court, which was closing soon, but there were still a few stalls open. I bought a bottle of water and sat near a pillar, glancing back toward gate C19. The man was gone. Relieved, I assumed he had left, but then I saw him again. This time, he was standing by the large windows overlooking the runway. He was looking out, but his body was oddly stiff. I caught sight of his face in the reflection of the glass, and for a split second I thought I saw something move behind him. A shadow, or maybe a figure. When I blinked, it was gone. I shook my head. I was tired. It had to be fatigue playing tricks on me. I made my way back toward gate C19, and as I passed the nearby vending machines, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace. The footsteps did too. Turning suddenly, I saw no one. The corridor was empty. The only light came from the flickering exit sign overhead. I felt a chill run down my spine and hurried back to my seat at the gate. The older man was now sitting again, but closer to the door, as if waiting to board. I stared, trying to make sense of it. I watched as a small group of passengers stood up and lined up to board. They showed their passes to the gate agent, scanned their IDs, and walked through the jet bridge to the plane. The man in the gray suit did not move. Minutes passed, and the last passenger disappeared into the aircraft. The gate agent stood, folded his arms, and began cleaning his counter. The man was still sitting. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered violently and went out completely for several seconds. When they came back on, the gate agent was gone. The man in the gray suit was gone too. The chairs around me were empty except for one, the seat directly in front of mine. I froze. The terminal was too silent, too still. A soft, low voice came from behind me, barely audible over the distant roar of a plane taking off. "You're not supposed to be here." I whipped around. No one was there. The boarding door to the plane at gate C19 creaked open slowly. I stood, heart pounding, and edged toward the jet bridge. I could see inside the plane through the doorway. Rows of empty seats. The cabin was dimly lit, but there was a faint haze, like smoke or mist, hanging low. Something wasn't right. I took a cautious step inside. The air was cold and smelled faintly of burnt rubber. The seats were empty, but I heard whispers, soft voices murmuring just beyond my hearing. I followed the aisle toward the rear, but the whispers grew louder, turning into low moans. The emergency lights blinked on suddenly, bathing the cabin in an eerie red glow. I felt a sudden pressure on my chest, like something invisible was pushing me back. The whispers turned into urgent pleading. "Don't stay. Get out." I spun around to leave, but froze when I noticed the plane's interior had changed. The seats were torn and stained, the windows cracked and darkened. The overhead bins were open, spilling personal belongings I couldn't recognize. Old photographs, worn suitcases, faded boarding passes. A name caught my eye on one boarding pass, Flight 212. Date, October 14th, 1967. I swallowed hard and stumbled back through the jet bridge into the terminal. When I turned around, the plane was gone. The gate was empty. No aircraft. No sign anyone had been there. The normal hum of the terminal returned, distant announcements, rolling luggage, footsteps. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I'd walked into some kind of time warp or ghost story. I wanted to tell someone, but the gate agent returned as if nothing had happened, checking boarding passes for the next flight. I sat back down, hands shaking, clutching my water bottle. My phone battery was low, so I tried to search the flight number I'd seen. Flight 212 from Chicago to New York crashed on October 14th, 1967. All passengers lost. I thought about the man in the gray suit. Was he one of them? Was he still waiting to board a plane that no longer existed? I left the airport that morning without looking back, refusing to take another flight through O'Hare late at night. I've never told anyone what I saw. Who would believe it? But sometimes, late at night, when the lights flicker and I'm somewhere unfamiliar, I swear I hear that low voice whispering, "Don't stay." Story the end.
Story number 3.
I landed at the small regional airport just after midnight, bleary-eyed and ready to get home. The flight had been delayed for hours because of a storm back east, and by the time we touched down, most of the passengers looked exhausted and restless. The airport itself was quiet, far quieter than I expected for a place that should have been buzzing with late-night travelers. I'd never been to this airport before. It was one of those little hubs that connected the outskirts to the big cities. You know, the kind of place where your layover lasts longer than your flight. After deplaning, the flight attendants herded us into the terminal building, announcing that our connecting flight would be delayed due to circumstances beyond their control. The terminal was dimly lit and smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals mixed with stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering occasionally. There was a gentle roar of the storm still happening outside, though through the big windows I could see nothing but thick rain slapping against the glass. I made my way toward the waiting area and sat near a window that looked out onto the tarmac. There was a lone plane parked there, its wingtip lights blinking rhythmically in the rain. Around me, a few other passengers gathered, some dozing, some scrolling on their phones. But oddly, there was no staff around. No gate agents, no security personnel, no janitors, just the occasional echo of distant footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. I pulled out my phone and tried to check the status of my connecting flight, but my screen was frustratingly blank. No signal, no Wi-Fi. Nothing. I even switched my phone off and on again, hoping it was just a glitch, but the screen remained dead to the world. Glancing up, I noticed the airport clock above the gates was frozen at 12:13 a.m. For a moment, I thought I might have misread it, but then I checked my watch. The same time. I looked around. No one else seemed to notice. People were quietly waiting, some shifting uneasily, others closing their eyes. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe the power was out or the airport systems were down. I decided to walk around the terminal, hoping to find a place to grab a snack or at least get some news. The vending machines were powered, but the only items left inside were old candy bars and bottles of water. Some looked faded, as if they had been there for months. Turning a corner, I spotted a coffee shop, but it was shuttered and dark, the door locked tight with a faded closed sign hanging crookedly. The seating area around it was covered in dust, and some chairs were overturned. It was as if the place had been abandoned for a long time. As I continued down the corridor, the lights flickered again, this time more aggressively. The hum from the ceiling panels buzzed and dipped, and I felt a strange pressure in my head, like a sudden migraine was coming on. I reached the restrooms, hoping to freshen up and collect myself. The door to the women's room was closed, but I noticed a man who had been standing nearby, suddenly vanish. I blinked, thinking maybe he'd gone inside, but the door remained closed. I stepped into the men's room and flicked on the light. The fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow. The sinks were dry, the mirrors streaked with grime. But what caught my attention was the faint smell of something rotten, like decaying fruit mixed with damp concrete. It was subtle but unmistakable. Then I heard it, a whisper, low and indistinct, coming from the far corner of the bathroom, near the stalls. I froze. "Hello?" I called softly. No response. The whispering grew louder, now sounding like multiple voices overlapping each other, but I still couldn't make out any words. Goosebumps erupted across my skin. I turned quickly to leave and almost collided with a man who had just entered. He looked pale and wide-eyed, clutching a briefcase tightly. "Did you hear that?" he asked breathlessly. I nodded. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Something's wrong." We hurried back to the terminal, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if it was pressing down on us. The distant hum of the storm was gone, replaced by an unnatural silence that filled every corner. I looked around and noticed that many passengers were gone. The waiting area was nearly empty. Where had everyone gone? Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried to call out to the remaining people, but the words caught in my throat. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the terminal's empty halls. They weren't walking toward us. They seemed to circle, always just out of sight. The man grabbed my arm. "We need to find an exit," he whispered urgently. I nodded and led him toward the main doors, but when we got there, the glass was blackened, as if covered in soot. No light passed through. I pressed my hands against it, but it was locked. And more than that, it was sealed. We turned back, and the footsteps stopped. A chill swept through the terminal. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. The faintest movement in the corner of my vision made me whip my head around, but nothing was there. We found a stairwell marked "Employees Only" and took it, hoping to find another way out. The stairwell descended deep underground, the walls lined with cracked concrete and exposed pipes that dripped water into puddles. The whispering followed us, growing louder, echoing off the walls. I could feel it crawling beneath my skin, like 1,000 voices pressing against my eardrums. At the bottom of the stairs, we entered a dimly lit hallway lined with old maintenance doors. The smell was overpowering here. Rotting metal, mold, something dead. Then the lights flickered off completely. In total darkness, I heard it. A breath right next to my ear. Cold, wet, rasping. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The man beside me grabbed my hand. "Run," he hissed. We sprinted down the hall, the whispering now a roar, voices screaming unintelligible words, a cacophony of madness. I barely saw the door ahead before we slammed into it, bursting through into a room that looked like a forgotten baggage storage area. Old suitcases, abandoned clothing, and torn luggage tags littered the floor. The walls were stained with something dark and sticky, and I felt like I was drowning in the stench. The man collapsed, gasping. "We have to stay together," he panted. I nodded, though fear was suffocating me. I looked toward the only exit, a rusted fire door. Suddenly, the shadows in the corner of the room shifted, coalescing into a shape. Tall. Thin. Its face obscured by darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing me, filled with malice. The whispering stopped. The room fell into complete silence. I don't know how long I stood frozen there. I don't know if it was seconds or minutes. Then a guttural growl echoed, and the figure lunged. I screamed. I don't remember the rest clearly. I woke up outside the terminal, the sun rising, rain still falling. People were bustling past me, some looking down with pity, others ignoring me entirely. I was covered in dirt and scratches, my clothes torn. When I asked what happened, they told me no one else was there overnight. The storm had delayed all flights. The airport had been closed, but I knew what I saw. I never went back to that airport, and I never will. because sometimes in the darkest hours, the places where people disappear are the ones you least expect. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was around 2 a.m. when I finally landed at JFK after a long, exhausting flight from London. The plane was half empty, which wasn't unusual at that hour, but the mood on board had been strange, tense, almost uneasy. A few passengers whispered about delays and security scares back in the city, but no one knew exactly what was going on. I was mostly just glad to be off the plane. The terminal was quiet and dimly lit, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by shadows and silence. Most of the shops and food stands were closed, and the automatic doors whooshed softly as I walked toward customs. The overhead screens flickered intermittently, some displaying flight information, others going blank. I had a layover 4 hours before my next flight to Boston, but the airport was mostly deserted. I found a bench near gate 32 and sat down, pulling out my phone to check messages. No service, not even the usual weak signal. That struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Maybe the airport system was down. As I sat there, the lights flickered again, this time more violently. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls. I looked around, but no one else was nearby. It was just me and the distant echo of footsteps that didn't match any person I could see. I stood and started to walk toward the food court, hoping to find some place open, or at least a working kiosk. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered. The walls, normally bright white and clean, now looked stained and cracked like an abandoned building. A smell of damp and mildew hung in the air. Then I saw her. A woman standing halfway down the corridor wearing a red jacket and jeans. She was staring at the wall, completely still, not moving or blinking. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. When I took a step closer, she slowly turned her head toward me. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition, no warmth, just a blank, empty stare. A shiver ran down my spine. I asked if she was okay, but she didn't answer. Then, without warning, she blinked once, and her face twisted into a silent scream. I stumbled back, heart pounding. Suddenly, the overhead lights went out, plunging the corridor into darkness. A faint red glow appeared ahead, casting long shadows. The woman was gone. I pulled out my phone again. Still no signal. The screen's light was flickering. Then it died. Panicked, I ran toward the glow, hoping it was an emergency exit or a security desk. The glow came from an emergency exit sign, but the door was locked. I banged on it, screaming for help, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the entire terminal was underwater. Behind me, footsteps echoed again, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I turned quickly, but no one was there. I backed away and saw the woman again, standing at the far end of the corridor, her mouth open as if to say something, but no sound came out. She began walking toward me, but her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a broken doll. I ran, heart racing, blindly through the darkened halls. The terminal twisted and turned, becoming a maze of identical doors and flickering lights. My breath came in ragged gasps. I couldn't find an exit. Ahead, I saw a gate labeled 37. Normally it was closed at this hour, but the gate was open, revealing a waiting plane on the tarmac. The engines were silent, but the door was open, stairs extended. I hesitated, but knew I had no choice. I boarded the plane, the metal steps creaking under my feet. Inside, the cabin was dark and empty, but the air smelled stale and cold. I walked down the aisle, searching for a cockpit door or any sign of life. At the front, the cockpit was open. I stepped inside. The controls were frozen, the panels covered in dust. On the pilot's seat sat a figure head down, face hidden under a flight cap. "Hello?" I whispered. The figure lifted its head slowly. Its face was pale, almost translucent, eyes hollow black voids. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The cockpit door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. Frantically, I tried the door handle. Locked. The radio crackled to life, and a voice whispered, "You should never have boarded." Static filled the cabin, then a chilling laugh echoed through the speakers. Suddenly, the plane shuddered, engines roaring to life. The cabin lights flickered on, revealing dozens of shadowy figures seated silently, passengers from other flights all staring straight ahead, eyes vacant. I turned to the cockpit window. Outside, the airport had vanished. Instead, endless clouds stretched in every direction, illuminated by a blood-red moon. The plane lurched forward and took off into the dark sky. I tried to scream, but no sound came. For what felt like hours, the plane soared through an endless night. The passengers never moved or blinked. The pilot never turned around. Finally, the plane began to descend. The red moon disappeared, replaced by a pale dawn. The plane touched down on a runway I didn't recognize, one cracked and overgrown with weeds surrounded by twisted trees. The doors opened, and the passengers began to rise, moving silently toward the forest. I ran after them, but the ground beneath my feet shifted like quicksand. The trees loomed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I fell, gasping. When I looked up, I was back in the terminal. The lights were bright. The sounds of people talking and rolling suitcases filled the air. My phone buzzed. I looked down. It was 6 a.m. My flight to Boston was boarding. But something was wrong. The gate number was 37. I sat down slowly, heart still racing. The terminal was full again, but none of the faces looked familiar. A woman near me in a red jacket caught my eye. She smiled, a cold, empty smile, and then she blinked. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The night my nightmare began, I was supposed to catch a late flight from LAX to Chicago. I was a frequent traveler for work and had grown used to the hum of the airport late at night. The tired eyes of travelers, the soft announcements echoing through cavernous terminals, and the constant shuffle of luggage wheels across tiled floors. That night, though, something was different. Something was wrong. My flight was scheduled for 11:45 p.m., giving me a few hours of downtime after a long day of meetings. The airport was crowded but subdued, the energy drained by the late hour. I found my gate and settled into a row of chairs, pulled out my laptop to finish some emails, and tried to drown out the noise with music. The usual background chatter felt muted, like the entire terminal was trapped under a glass dome muffling sound. Around 10:30 p.m., the first oddity hit me. The large electronic display board flickered erratically, the flight statuses scrambling between on time and delayed before settling back to normal. A few people nearby noticed, but shrugged it off. I thought maybe it was a software glitch. The boarding gate agents announced the first call for my flight a little after 11 p.m., earlier than expected. The boarding pass on my phone still said the boarding time was 11:30 p.m., but the display board had updated the departure to 11:15 p.m. Confused, I gathered my things and moved closer to the gate. When I arrived, the gate was nearly empty. There were just a handful of passengers clustered near the desk, none of whom I recognized. The gate agents looked harried and distracted, speaking in hushed tones to each other. When they noticed me, they paused and then motioned me forward. I handed over my boarding pass and ID. The agent scanned it, paused, then looked up with a flicker of unease. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied. She hesitated and then nodded, scanning my boarding pass again. "Please wait here. We're just finalizing something." As I waited, I noticed the airport lighting began to dim subtly, casting long shadows. The noise in the terminal faded further until it felt eerily silent. I looked around for other passengers, but many had disappeared. Where once there were 50 people milling about, there were now less than 10. An announcement crackled over the PA system, but the voice was distorted and almost unintelligible. It sounded like a garbled message saying, "Final call for Flight 389." But it was not my flight number. When I glanced back at the display board, the gate number next to Flight 389 was mine. The crowd thinned even more. The few remaining passengers seemed tense, eyes darting nervously toward the jet bridge. I took a step closer to the gate, heart pounding. The sliding glass door to the jet bridge was open. I moved toward it, and something felt wrong about the air inside. The temperature had dropped, and the smell was faint but unmistakably metallic, like blood. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Not hurried, but deliberate and slow. I turned sharply. No one was there. The shadows stretched in strange ways along the floor and walls. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered again, and the PA crackled out a final, distorted boarding call. I stepped into the jet bridge. It was darker inside than outside. The soft hum of the airplane engines I expected was absent. At the far end where the plane should have been docked, there was only blackness. I thought for a moment I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I pulled out my phone to check the time and texts, but it was dead. No signal, no power. The blackness ahead shifted. Shapes seemed to move in the void. A low whisper filled the air, but I couldn't understand the words, only the tone. a warning, or a threat. I tried to back out, but my feet felt heavy, as if stuck in quicksand. Panic bloomed in my chest. I forced a step backward. Suddenly, a hand grasped my wrist. Cold. Ice cold. I yanked away and spun around. A figure stood behind me, tall, in a dark uniform, face obscured by shadows. "Boarding," the figure whispered, voice dry and hollow. I bolted. Running back toward the terminal, I burst through the jet bridge door and found myself alone again. The terminal was empty now. Chairs overturned, bags scattered. The once bustling airport had become a ghost town. In the distance, I heard the same distorted boarding call echoing from all directions, growing louder and more urgent. I sprinted toward the main concourse, desperate to find help. Every hallway looked the same, endless and twisting. The familiar signs were blurred or changed. The exit signs flickered and led me deeper into the maze. I saw no staff, no other passengers, only shadows and whispers. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a small service room filled with cleaning equipment. I locked the door behind me, heart racing, chest burning with panic. I called 911 on my phone. No signal. I screamed for help. No reply. The lights flickered off. When they returned, the room was empty. My phone was on the floor, cracked screen blinking faintly. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The airport nightmare haunted me. The memory of that empty gate and the faceless figure's grip on my wrist seared into my mind. Weeks later, I learned the airport had a long history of unexplained disappearances, mostly late-night travelers who vanished without a trace. The stories spoke of an airport gate that appeared and disappeared, a place where reality bent and time warped. I never flew late at night again, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the distorted boarding call beckoning me back to gate D18. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The night I spent at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport is something I still can't explain fully. And honestly, I've debated whether to even talk about it out loud. But every time I think about it, the memories come rushing back with the same cold knot in my stomach. And I feel like I owe it to myself to finally get it out there. Somewhere. It was late November 2018. I was returning from a business trip to Seattle and had a long layover at ATL before my final flight home to Miami. The storm that had been brewing all day finally hit that night, dumping rain and wind like I'd never seen before. Flights were delayed or canceled, and the airport was crowded with frustrated travelers. But after midnight, the crowds thinned out, leaving behind a quiet, almost empty terminal that felt vast and hollow. My original flight was delayed by 4 hours, then pushed back again, and eventually canceled. The airline booked me on a flight at 8 a.m. the next morning. With nothing to do and no hotel nearby willing to take a last-minute guest on a stormy night, I decided to just stay in the terminal and wait it out. I found a corner in Concourse E near Gate E18, where a few other travelers were scattered around in various states of exhaustion. I tried to read, but the storm outside was so loud it was impossible to concentrate. The windows rattled with the wind, and water streamed down the glass in thick rivulets. The lights flickered occasionally, but the terminal stayed mostly lit, though some areas further down the concourse were shrouded in shadows. Around 2 a.m., I decided to stretch my legs and walk around a bit. Sitting still was making me restless, and the cold air made me shiver. I wandered past the gates, most closed and empty now. A handful of airport employees were doing their rounds, some pushing carts, others chatting quietly in groups. As I walked past gate E22, I noticed a small hallway I hadn't seen before. It was narrow, marked only by a faded sign that read "Service Access," with a small arrow pointing down a dim corridor. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The corridor was tight, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering, casting a sickly yellow glow. The air smelled musty, like something had been sealed away for a long time. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the bare concrete walls. About 50 feet in, I spotted a door, cracked open, a faint light glowing from inside. I leaned closer and saw what looked like an old storage room, cluttered with cleaning supplies and some old maintenance equipment. But then I saw her. Sitting on the floor in the corner was a woman. Her hair was long, black, and tangled, hanging over her face. She wore a faded uniform that looked like it belonged to airport staff, but it was dirty and torn. She didn't move when I approached. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed her eyes. They were pitch black. No whites, no iris, just deep black pools staring straight ahead. A chill ran down my spine, and my throat went dry. "I'm going to get some help," I said, turning to leave. Before I could move, she stood up, slowly. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like she was struggling to control her body. Then she smiled. Only it wasn't a smile. Her mouth stretched wider than possible, revealing jagged teeth that seemed too large for her thin face. A low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a kind of hiss mixed with a growl. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I was trapped in the storage room with her. I banged on the door and screamed for help, but the corridor outside was silent. No footsteps, no voices, just the storm roaring somewhere far away. She advanced toward me, and I scrambled back, searching for anything to defend myself. I grabbed a metal mop handle leaning against the wall and held it out in front of me, trembling. She lunged, but as she came closer, the lights flickered violently and the room plunged into darkness. I heard her scream, a terrible, inhuman scream that cut through the silence like a knife. Then, silence. When the emergency lights kicked in a few seconds later, she was gone. The door unlocked itself, creaking open slowly. I didn't wait to find out what happened next. I bolted out of the room, sprinted down the corridor, and back into the main terminal. Everything looked normal again. People sleeping in chairs, a janitor quietly sweeping, the faint hum of the airport at night. I reported the incident to the nearest security guard, but when I told him about the storage room and the woman, his face went pale. "There's no storage room down that hall," he said quietly. "And no one's worked those corridors in years. They're supposed to be sealed off." I asked if there had ever been any incidents or accidents in the airport, and he hesitated before saying that a cleaning staff member had gone missing years ago near that area. The official story was that she'd quit, but rumors said she disappeared without a trace. I left the airport as soon as my flight was called. I've never gone back to ATL after dark. Some nights when the wind howls and the rain taps against my window, I can still hear that hiss, like the woman's voice calling out from somewhere in the shadows. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in that room a moment longer. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The airport was nearly empty by the time I arrived at Denver International for my midnight layover. I was flying home from a conference in San Francisco, the last leg of a long, exhausting trip. My connection wasn't until nearly 3 a.m., so I had several hours to kill. The terminal was silent except for the occasional murmur of a distant cleaning crew and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I made my way to the seating area near Gate B12 and settled down with my backpack as a pillow. The cold draft from the large glass windows overlooking the tarmac sent a chill through me. I pulled my jacket tighter and tried to nap, but the atmosphere was off. Not just the loneliness of the place, but something deeper, like the building itself was holding its breath. Around 1 a.m., the overhead lights flickered, briefly plunging the terminal into a dim, shadowy gloom before snapping back on. The PA system buzzed, then crackled, but no announcement followed. I looked up toward the gate counter. It was deserted. My gut told me something was wrong. I decided to walk around, hoping to find an open cafe or at least some other stranded traveler to talk to. The food court was shut tight behind steel shutters. The only sounds were my footsteps echoing off the polished floors and the faint clatter of a janitor's cart somewhere far off. As I passed the security checkpoint, which was completely unstaffed, I noticed a man standing alone near gate B14. He wore an old-fashioned trench coat and a wide-brimmed fedora that obscured most of his face. He was oddly still, staring intently at the gate's departure board. His presence was unnatural, almost spectral. "Excuse me," I said, trying to break the silence. "Are you waiting for a flight?" He didn't respond. He didn't even blink, just kept staring at the screen. The board flickered and shifted, then settled on a single listing. Flight 713 to Rockford, boarding now at gate B14. The time displayed was 1:15 a.m., but I knew the real schedule said no such flight was operating tonight. "Flight 713, I repeated quietly. "Rockford? That's not a real flight, is it?" He turned his head slowly toward me. His eyes were sunken, with a strange pale haze over the irises. His mouth moved in a dry whisper. "It's time." Before I could react, the boarding door next to gate B14 creaked open, revealing a dimly lit jet bridge. The man stepped forward, disappearing into the shadows. I felt a sudden urge to follow him. Against my better judgment, I walked through the open door. The jet bridge stretched much longer than normal, twisting like a dark tunnel lined with flickering lights. I heard distant murmurs, low, unintelligible voices echoing down the corridor. My heart pounded in my chest. At the end of the jet bridge, I emerged into a dimly lit airplane cabin, unlike any I'd seen. The seats were worn and stained, the overhead bins hanging open and empty. The emergency lights cast an eerie red glow. The air smelled stale, like mold and forgotten memories. The voices grew louder, now sounding like whispers pleading for help. I moved down the aisle, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I passed rows of empty seats until I reached the back of the plane. There, a group of shadowy figures huddled together, faces blurred and indistinct. They turned toward me, mouths opening in silent screams. Panic seized me. I turned to run, but the aisle stretched endlessly, twisting impossibly longer. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I spun around. The man in the trench coat was behind me, his face twisted into a mournful expression. "You can't leave," he said softly. "Once you step aboard Flight 713, you're part of the journey." I broke free and bolted back down the aisle, the shadows reaching for me, their whispers growing desperate. I stumbled back into the jet bridge, then into the terminal. The door slammed shut behind me. I gasped for breath. The terminal was bright again, that shut, busy with the usual pre-dawn crowd and bustling workers. The mysterious man and the ghostly flight were gone. I checked my watch. Only 5 minutes had passed, but my mind felt shattered. I went straight to the information desk to ask about Flight 713 to Rockford. The attendant looked at me blankly. "No such flight. Rockford isn't served from this airport." I showed her the gate and time. She shook her head. "There's no gate B14 anymore. That section's been closed off for renovations." That's when I realized the worst part. The gate where I'd seen the man and the phantom flight didn't exist anymore. It was sealed off months ago after a mysterious fire. Since then, I avoid late-night layovers and never walk alone near empty gates. But sometimes when I'm drifting to sleep, I still hear those desperate whispers, begging me to board a flight that never leaves. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
The airport was supposed to be a place of routine, of transition, of brief pauses between flights and destinations. But on that night, it became something else entirely. Something I can't quite explain. Something that still haunts me. I was flying back home to Seattle from Denver after a late business conference. My flight landed just after midnight at SeaTac. I wasn't expecting much, just a short wait in the terminal before my connecting flight to Portland. The airport was mostly quiet. At that hour, most shops were closed and the usual crowds had thinned out. I made my way through the dim corridors toward the baggage claim. The lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering now and then. A stale, cold draft drifted through the wide halls. I noticed the usual sounds, rolling suitcases, distant announcements, hushed voices, were muted, almost absent. The airport felt unnaturally empty, but I told myself it was just late. I found a bench near the carousel and sat down, waiting for my bag. My phone showed no signal. The Wi-Fi was dead. This was strange. Usually SeaTac's network is reliable, even late at night. After 20 minutes with no bags on the carousel, I grew restless. I decided to check the flight information screens to confirm my connection. The screens were all blank, some flickering erratically like old television sets. Overhead speakers crackled, then suddenly broadcast a distorted message. A voice warped and slow, repeating fragments of words I couldn't quite catch. "Flight delayed, safety concerns, do not depart, please remain." I glanced around but saw no staff, no other passengers, just the dull hum of the fluorescent lights. A creeping sensation crawled up my spine. I stood and began to walk toward the gates to see if I could find an employee or any open shop. The terminal stretched further than I expected, corridors bending oddly, longer than normal. The usual signs pointing toward exits or lounges were missing. Instead, some doors were boarded up or covered in peeling tape. At one point, I passed a janitor mopping the floor, but he didn't look up. His eyes were glazed, staring into space as if he saw something no one else could. When I tried to ask if anyone was around, he muttered something I couldn't hear and quickly turned a corner. I felt the urge to leave but found myself disoriented. The terminal no longer looked familiar. The clean, modern design was replaced by cracked tiles and flickering bulbs. Shadows pooled in the corners and a low whispering filled the air. It was almost inaudible, but persistent. I quickened my pace, heading toward what I thought was the exit, but the doors opened to reveal an endless dark hallway, lit only by a few emergency exit signs flickering dimly. The smell of mildew and rust filled my nostrils. I called out, but no one answered. My footsteps echoed back at me in strange delays, as if the corridor was longer than it appeared. Up ahead, I saw a figure, a man in a pilot's uniform, standing motionless with his back turned. I called to him. He didn't move. I walked closer. His head slowly turned, revealing hollow eyes and a face pale as death. I froze. Before I could react, the lights in the hallway went out entirely. When they flickered back on, the pilot was gone. Panicked, I tried to retrace my steps, but found the hallway had changed. Doors I'd passed before were now sealed shut. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into unintelligible murmurs, pressing in on me from all sides. My breathing grew shallow. The air felt thick, heavy. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, steady, deliberate. I spun around. No one. I ran. The hallway twisted, warped, as if the building itself was alive and rearranging. I stumbled through doorways leading to places I had never seen in any airport. A dark storage room filled with broken luggage and abandoned shoes, a forgotten locker room drenched in mold, a narrow staircase spiraling down into the unknown. The footsteps followed me, never stopping. I reached a large open space that resembled the terminal's main hall but was distorted. The windows were shattered, and outside was an endless storm of gray clouds swirling violently. A plane sat on the tarmac, its engines silent, lights dimmed. I walked toward the plane, drawn to it despite my fear. The boarding ramp extended toward me, beckoning. Inside, the cabin was empty, except for a few seats stained with dark smudges. The air smelled of decay. I moved to the cockpit. The door creaked open. Inside, the pilot sat slumped over, hands gripping the controls. As I stepped in, he lifted his head. His face was the same pale, hollow-eyed visage from before. He whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Suddenly, the plane shook violently, alarms blaring. The cabin lights flickered and went dark. In the pitch black, I felt cold hands grasp my arms, pulling me down. When the lights returned, the plane was empty. I was alone. A voice crackled over the radio. Flight 237, final boarding. The door slammed shut. I screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't open. The engines roared to life. The plane took off into the swirling storm outside. I was trapped in a nightmare, soaring through an endless void, surrounded by the ghosts of passengers lost long ago. Their hollow eyes watched me in silence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning. The plane finally descended, landing on a cracked, abandoned runway surrounded by dead trees and fog. The doors opened, revealing a figure in a red jacket standing silently. She turned toward me, eyes empty but somehow filled with sorrow. I stepped out into the cold mist. Then everything went black. I woke up on a bench in the terminal. The sun was rising. The airport was alive again, full of people rushing, announcements blaring. My phone buzzed. A message, "Flight 237 canceled. Please see gate agent." I looked up. The gate number was 23. But I didn't remember ever boarding that flight, and the woman in the red jacket was nowhere to be found. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The day started off like any other business trip. I'd flown dozens of times before, spent countless hours navigating airports, hopping from one gate to the next, waiting out layovers, and trying to catch sleep wherever I could. But what happened during this trip at the Denver International Airport changed how I viewed travel forever. It's something I still can't explain, and I doubt anyone would believe me if I told them. But it's true. Every word. I was flying out of Denver late at night, a Monday flight, nearly midnight. My job required frequent trips, and this time I was returning home after a week-long conference. I'd landed in Denver earlier that day and was waiting for my connection to Dallas-Fort Worth. The terminal was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. People murmured quietly, pulling luggage, lining up for coffee, scrolling on their phones. I was sitting near gate B36, the departure gate for my next flight. The announcements crackled overhead with the usual flight updates and boarding calls. Nothing felt unusual at first. I got up once to grab a snack and a bottle of water, then returned to my seat. I had a bit of time, nearly 2 hours before boarding. It was just past 10 p.m. when the atmosphere in the terminal started to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The overhead lights seemed to dim, then brighten again. I noticed a few people around me looking up, puzzled by the flickering. A faint electrical hum buzzed through the vents. The flight information screens on the wall started to glitch, flickering between different flights and gate numbers. Strange, I muttered to myself. Then the loudspeaker came to life with a distorted message. Flight to Dallas, final call to gate B37. Flight to Dallas, final call to gate B37. But I knew that my flight was departing from gate B36. I turned to a nearby airport employee, a woman who was restocking magazines. "Excuse me," I said, "is the flight to Dallas leaving from B37 or B36? She blinked at me, confused. B36, I think. That's what the board says." She glanced at the screens, but they were flickering rapidly now, cycling through gate numbers and destinations in a blur. Then it happened. The crowd near my gate began to thin out. People who had been waiting just moments before started to get up and move away, muttering about delays or gate changes. Some passengers simply vanished. I watched one man in a red jacket walk out of sight behind a group of people, and when I looked again, he was gone, as if swallowed by the air. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I checked my phone. No signal. The usual background noise of the terminal was fading, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed in on me. The few passengers left were frozen, their faces blank and unmoving, like mannequins. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the gate desk. The agents behind the counter looked as if they were frozen in time, staring ahead with glassy eyes. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, and the air grew cold, too cold for an indoor terminal in a desert climate. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around. No one. Only shadows stretching long and unnatural against the walls. I hurried toward the jet bridge. The doors of the plane should have been open, ready for boarding, but the glass doors were closed and locked. I pressed the intercom button. Static. No response. I glanced down the jet bridge hallway. It stretched into darkness. No plane was docked at the gate. The usual noises, jet engines humming, crew calling out, were absent. The silence was suffocating. Suddenly, the distorted voice from the loudspeaker returned, louder this time. "Final call, final call, final call." The jet bridge doors began to slide open slowly. I hesitated, but then stepped inside. The air inside was thick and cold, like walking into a freezer. The lights were out, my phone's flashlight was dead, and the darkness swallowed me. I heard breathing, deep and ragged, echoing off the metal walls. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic gripped me as I pounded on the door. Nothing. Ahead, in the blackness, a figure emerged. Tall, hunched, featureless, its outline wavering like smoke. It reached out a skeletal hand. I stumbled backward, heart racing. My breath came in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the lights snapped on. The figure vanished. I ran out of the jet bridge and into the terminal, but it was empty. No people, no staff. Just an endless expanse of vacant gates, flickering lights, and endless corridors. I wandered for what felt like hours, trying to find an exit, but every door led to another hallway, looping endlessly. The distorted announcement played over and over again, "Final call! Final call!" I collapsed onto the floor, exhausted and terrified. When I woke up, I was back in the waiting area at gate B36. The terminal was normal again, lights steady, people milling about, the scent of coffee brewing. I blinked in confusion. Was it a nightmare? A hallucination? I checked my watch. Hours had passed, but no one seemed to notice I'd been gone. When I looked back at the gate, I noticed something carved into the armrest of my chair. 4 numbers. 1937. I never found out what those numbers meant. I boarded the flight home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something followed me from that terminal. The memories haunt me every time I fly. I never told anyone the full story, because who would believe me? But it's true. Denver International Airport holds secrets in its shadows, secrets I wish I'd never uncovered. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
The night shift at the airport had always been strange, but nothing quite like what I experienced one November evening. I was working as a security officer at Denver International Airport, a job I'd taken after college while trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. The pay wasn't great and the hours were brutal, but it gave me time to think and plenty of weird stories to tell. That night started like any other. The storm was just beginning to roll in, a steady rain mixed with gusty winds. The airport was busy with delayed flights and tired travelers. I was assigned to patrol the East Wing, where most of the international gates were located. The terminal was a sprawling maze of glass, steel, and concrete, illuminated by cold fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Around midnight, I finished a routine check near Gate 34, a remote gate that rarely saw many passengers at that hour. As I walked back toward the main terminal, the power flickered for a moment and the lights dimmed. It was nothing unusual during a storm, but it made the shadows seem longer, deeper. I passed a cluster of empty chairs where a few late travelers were dozing off. Then something caught my eye, a woman standing near the edge of the seating area, just beyond the light's reach. She was wearing a long, dark coat, her face obscured by a hood. What struck me was her posture. Completely still, unnervingly so, almost like she was frozen in place. "Ma'am?" I called out, stepping closer. No response. She didn't move or turn. I walked up beside her. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to look at her face, but the hood shadowed it so completely I could see nothing. "Can I help you?" I asked again. Still, silence. Feeling a little uneasy, I decided to get a closer look. As I reached out to touch her shoulder, she vanished. Gone. Just like that. I spun around, heart racing, scanning the area. There was no sign of anyone else. No footsteps, no sounds. Just the distant hum of the airport's ventilation system. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion playing tricks on me, but the feeling of cold dread lingered. I radioed my partner to check the area, but he found nothing. No woman in a dark coat, no sign of anyone lurking nearby. As I continued my patrol, I noticed something odd on the terminal monitors. An unscheduled flight had just landed at Gate 36. The problem? No records showed any planes scheduled to arrive there that night. I decided to check it out. Walking over to Gate 36, the corridor was eerily quiet. The storm outside made the occasional roar as wind hit the terminal's glass walls. The gate area was deserted, no passengers, no crew. Then, a low noise. It was faint, almost like whispering coming from the jet bridge. I cautiously stepped onto the bridge. The whispering grew louder, almost intelligible, but I couldn't make out the words. My flashlight flickered, and the temperature dropped suddenly, breath visible in the air. At the end of the bridge was the aircraft door, closed. I knocked, no response. I radioed for backup, but before anyone could answer, the door creaked open slowly by itself. I shined my flashlight inside the dark cabin. The seats were empty, dust coating everything like it hadn't been used in years. The lights inside the plane flickered erratically. Then, from the back of the cabin, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving toward me. I backed out quickly and slammed the door shut. I radioed security again, demanding someone come immediately. My partner arrived within minutes, and we both searched the plane thoroughly. Empty. No sign of any living passenger or crew. Confused, I asked the control tower about the flight. They confirmed no plane had landed at Gate 36 that night. We reported it as a security glitch, a phantom flight. But I knew what I'd heard. The footsteps, the whispers. Something was there. After that night, strange things kept happening. I'd be monitoring the CCTV cameras when a figure would appear briefly on screen. Someone walking through restricted areas or staring directly into the camera, then disappearing moments later. Other security officers reported hearing unexplained noises in empty terminals, whispers, footsteps, the slam of doors that should have been locked. One colleague claimed she saw the woman in the dark coat standing silently outside the airport's perimeter fence, watching the runway. The strangest thing was that these sightings all seemed connected to the East Wing and that mysterious Gate 36. One evening, I found a notebook left on a bench near that gate. Inside were scribbled notes and sketches of shadowy figures, strange symbols, and mentions of ghost flights and lost souls trapped between arrivals and departures. Some of the notes referenced a tragic accident decades earlier, a small plane crash that had taken off from Gate 36's terminal long before the current airport was built. The crash killed all passengers, and some locals believe the spirits still lingered. I started to believe them. One night, during a particularly bad thunderstorm, the power went out entirely in the East Wing. Emergency lights bathed the terminal in a ghostly red glow. I was alone on patrol when I heard the whispers again, clearer this time. Help us. I followed the sound, heart pounding, to the end of the jet bridge. There, in the faint red light, I saw a group of translucent figures, faces etched with fear and confusion. They were trapped, waiting for a flight that would never come. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were frozen. Then a booming clap of thunder shook the terminal, and the figures vanished. The power returned, and the normal sounds of the airport resumed. I left soon after, unable to shake the feeling I was no longer alone in that space. Now I'm no longer working security at Denver. I moved far away, but sometimes I get calls from my old colleagues asking if I've heard the latest stories. Missing bags that reappear full of dirt and old newspapers, flight announcements for planes that don't exist, shadows moving in empty halls. I don't want to go back, but I know those lost souls are still there, stuck in limbo, waiting for their final boarding call. Story the end.
Story number 11.
The moment I stepped off the plane, a strange stillness settled over the airport. It was late, well past midnight, and the usual buzz of activity had died down to a near silence. My flight had been delayed due to weather, and now I was stuck in this small, out-of-the-way airport for what the gate agent said would be at least a few hours. I wasn't worried. I'd been through worse layovers, but this one felt different. The air had a heavy weight, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I moved through the terminal, my footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in ways that weren't natural. I glanced at the other passengers. There weren't many left. Most sat quietly in clusters or stood by the windows, staring out into the dark tarmac. A handful of airport employees shuffled by in faded uniforms, their faces pale and eyes hollow, barely acknowledging the travelers. I found a spot near Gate 7, the window behind me showing rows of empty jetways and planes parked, their engines silent. The rain outside was light but steady, tapping a rhythmic pattern against the glass. My phone showed no signal, and the terminal's Wi-Fi was down, likely from the storm. I tried to ignore the growing unease twisting in my stomach. After about 30 minutes, an announcement crackled over the PA system, but the voice was distorted and nearly indecipherable. The few words I caught were, "Flight delayed indefinitely, and passengers advised to wait." The static seemed to whisper just beneath the surface, a sibilant hiss that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stood up, deciding to walk around. Maybe moving would shake off the tension. As I wandered down the concourse, the terminal seemed to stretch longer than it should. The walls, once clean and bright, looked stained and worn, as if decades of neglect had finally seeped through the surface. Doors marked "Employees Only" hung ajar, revealing darkened hallways that swallowed the light. The further I went, the more disorienting it became. The signs above the gates flickered, some blinking out entirely. I passed a closed cafe where the menu board was covered in dust, and chairs sat haphazardly on tables as if the place had been abandoned. I noticed that the few passengers still milling about had disappeared. It was just me now. Turning a corner, I nearly bumped into a man who seemed out of place. He was tall, with a long black coat that dragged slightly behind him, his face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes were deep pools of black, reflecting no light. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. The man didn't speak, only nodded once before disappearing down a side corridor. I called out but heard only my own voice swallowed by the cold air. I decided to follow him, curiosity overtaking caution. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, the walls peeling with cracked paint. At the end, the man stood in front of a door marked "Baggage Claim." He pushed it open and I slipped inside behind him. The room was vast and empty, save for a single conveyor belt that creaked softly as it turned in place. There were no lights, just the faint glow from the emergency exit signs casting long red shadows. Suddenly the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air and a low hum filled the room, vibrating in my chest. The man's figure began to blur, stretching and contorting into something unrecognizable. I blinked and he was gone. Behind me, I heard the conveyor belt slow and stop. A suitcase rattled onto the floor, opening to reveal old photographs, black and white images of smiling families, children playing. But as I leaned in, the faces warped, their eyes hollow, and mouths twisted into silent screams. I stumbled back, heart pounding. A soft whisper echoed around me, fragmented voices calling my name. I turned toward the shadows, and dark shapes flickered just beyond my vision. Panic surged, and I ran from the room, the whispering chasing me down the hallways. Back in the main terminal, the lights flickered wildly, and the PA system blared static screams before cutting out entirely. I saw movement in the glass, figures pressed against the windows, their faces pale and distorted, eyes wide with desperation. They mouthed silent words I couldn't understand. I sprinted toward the main exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, panic flooding every nerve. Behind me, the whispering returned, louder and more urgent, like 100 voices screaming all at once. In desperation, I ran toward the stairwell and descended into the basement levels, where the airport's maintenance tunnels sprawled like a labyrinth. The air was thick with mold and rust, and I could hear distant dripping water echoing off concrete walls. Footsteps followed me, slow and measured. I dared not look back. I found a heavy metal door marked emergency exit and shoved it open, bursting into the cold night air. The rain had stopped and the moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light across the empty parking lot. I ran to the nearest road, waving down a passing car. The driver looked at me with a mix of pity and fear as I recounted my experience. Later, I learned that the airport had no record of any delayed flights that night. Staff who had been scheduled were told to stay home due to the storm. The terminal I wandered was supposedly closed for renovations. But the photographs, the whispering voices, the figures in the windows, they haunt me still. Sometimes I wonder if I really left that terminal or if I'm still trapped inside, waiting for a flight that will never come. Story the end.
Story number 12.
It was a typical late autumn evening when I arrived at the international airport, bleary-eyed and just wanting to get home after a grueling week of work overseas. My flight had been delayed multiple times, and by the time I finally landed, the terminal was mostly empty except for a handful of travelers like me, waiting to connect or to be picked up. I had a 6-hour layover at the airport, which I had always found to be a somewhat uncomfortable limbo. Stuck in a place that isn't quite here or there, a transit point with endless corridors and fluorescent lighting. I found a corner near Gate 42, settled in on a plastic bench, and tried to rest. The noise of rolling suitcases and distant announcements was a dull background hum, but something about this particular terminal felt different that night. Around midnight, the terminal was nearly deserted. A janitor was quietly mopping the floors down the hall. Occasionally, a lone traveler would shuffle past, whispering into a phone or dragging a carry-on behind them. The usual smells of coffee and cleaning supplies mingled with the stale scent of recycled air. I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed a man standing near the entrance to Gate 43. He was middle-aged, wearing a dark trench coat and a fedora pulled low over his face. The way he stood was peculiar, rigid, unmoving, like a statue placed there to guard the gate. I didn't think much of it at first. Airports attract all sorts of people. But after a few minutes, I realized the man hadn't moved an inch, hadn't even turned his head. Curious, I watched him for a while. His presence felt heavy, oppressive, as if the air around him grew colder. The overhead lights flickered briefly, and for a second, I thought I saw his eyes, sharp, black, hollow, reflecting no light. I shook my head and tried to focus elsewhere. Maybe I was just tired and imagining things. But then the lights flickered again, this time more violently, and the terminal suddenly went dark for a few seconds. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie red glows on the walls. People nearby murmured in confusion, and the janitor stopped mopping to look around nervously. When the lights came back on, the man was gone. I stood up, heart pounding. The whole area felt different, colder, as if the warmth and bustle of the airport had been sucked out of the room. I tried calling a friend to shake off the unease, but my phone had no signal. Odd, I thought. The airport always has at least some coverage. A boarding announcement echoed down the corridor, a voice distorted and warped like it was underwater. It called for passengers boarding Flight 732 to London, but the gate number was unfamiliar, one I hadn't seen on the departure boards anywhere. Curiosity pulled me toward the gate, mentioned in the announcement, one labeled A43, the same gate near where the strange man had stood. I walked cautiously down the hallway. The overhead lights flickered again as I approached. The air was thick and cold, and a strange humming filled my ears. I reached the gate and found the door ajar. Peering inside, the waiting area was empty, the chairs covered in dust and cobwebs, as if no one had been there in years. I heard the faintest whispering, incoherent murmurs echoing from the depths of the terminal beyond. Stepping inside, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, but no one was there. The door slammed shut with a thud, and the lights flickered violently, plunging me into near darkness, except for a faint, unnatural glow emanating from the far end of the corridor. The whispers grew louder, circling me like a cold wind, pressing against my skin. Panic rose in my chest. I turned to run back, but the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and warping. The exit doors I'd seen moments ago were nowhere to be found. The glowing light ahead pulsed with an unholy rhythm, and from the shadows emerged figures, translucent, distorted shapes that flickered between human and something else. Their eyes were empty voids, mouths opened in silent screams. I backed away, heart racing, the whispers turning into agonized wails. I tried calling for help, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. My phone was dead. Suddenly, a figure stepped forward, the man in the trench coat, but his form was twisted, almost spectral, eyes burning like coals. He reached out with long, thin fingers that felt like icy knives. I screamed, stumbling backward, desperate to escape. The hallway behind me shimmered and shifted, and I found myself suddenly outside the terminal, blinking under the bright airport lights. People rushed past as if nothing had happened. The man was gone. The gate A43 was nowhere to be found on the terminal maps or departure boards. I clutched my chest, gasping for breath. My phone flickered back to life and the signal returned. An announcement blared overhead. My flight was now boarding at gate 42. I hurried there and boarded, but I never forgot the cold presence, the hollow eyes, or the whispered voices calling from that forgotten gate. Since that night, whenever I travel through airports, I can't shake the feeling that something watches from the shadows, waiting for the next traveler to disappear into the endless, twisting corridors. Story the end.
Story number 13.
The airport was supposed to be a place of transit, a nexus of hurried footsteps, announcements, and the dull glow of screens listing flights. But that night, it became something else entirely, a place where time and reality twisted into something darker. I work as a flight attendant for a major airline, and while the job has its perks, the hours can be brutal. That night, I had just finished an exhausting red-eye from Seattle to Dallas, and my layover at Dallas-Fort Worth was unusually long, almost 6 hours. The airport was unusually quiet for such a large hub. Most shops and restaurants were closed, leaving just a few stranded passengers wandering the terminal. I found a quiet corner near gate D22 to rest. The lights overhead were dimmed, and the vast space felt cavernous, almost empty. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and closed my eyes for a brief moment. When I opened them, I noticed a man standing a few feet away near the window that overlooked the tarmac. He looked out at the planes parked below, but his posture was rigid, almost unnatural. He wore an old-fashioned suit, something that looked like it was from the 1950s. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes were fixed on a plane that wasn't there anymore. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached him cautiously. "Excuse me," I said softly. "Are you okay? Waiting for a flight?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned slowly to look at me. His eyes were pale, almost translucent, and his face was expressionless. "The plane's boarding soon," he said in a voice that was cold and hollow. "You should come." I felt a chill and instinctively stepped back. "What flight is that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He pointed toward the gate across the terminal. "Flight 501. I frowned. That flight number didn't sound familiar. I glanced at the departure board nearby and scanned the list of flights. Nothing named Flight 501 was scheduled. The closest was Flight 510, but that was to Atlanta, scheduled to depart the next day. "Flight 501 doesn't show on the board," I said, more firmly now. He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "It will soon. Boarding begins any moment now. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, and the terminal fell into near darkness for a few seconds. When they flickered back on, the man was gone. I stood there, feeling uneasy. I looked toward the gate he had indicated. The gate area was empty, quiet, except for the soft hum of air conditioning. I shook my head and tried to convince myself I was just tired, that the long hours had caught up with me. I decided to get some coffee and pass the time. As I walked down the terminal, I passed a security checkpoint that had been temporarily closed due to renovations. Normally, the area was barricaded, but that night, the barriers had been removed. I noticed the gate number beyond, D23, was lit and active, even though all the signage suggested it should be closed. A strange impulse pulled me toward it. I crossed the line where the barriers had been and stepped through the gate. The corridor beyond was dark, lit only by the dim glow of emergency lights. The walls were lined with peeling paint and cracked tiles. The floor creaked under my feet. I heard the faint sound of an engine starting up, a distant roar that seemed oddly close. Then I saw it, an old-fashioned airplane parked at the gate with its engines idling softly. The aircraft looked ancient, like a relic from the 1940s. Its metal surface was dull and scratched. The windows were fogged, and the boarding stairs were extended, inviting passengers on board. I hesitated, then stepped closer. I could see the name painted on the side, Flight 501, Dallas to New Orleans. The roar of the engines was hypnotic. Then I saw the man from before, standing at the foot of the stairs. He beckoned to me with a slow, deliberate wave. "Come," he said again. "It's time." Against all reason, I found myself climbing the stairs and stepping inside. The cabin was dimly lit, but a warm glow emanated from the ceiling lights. The seats were upholstered in worn leather, and the air smelled faintly of old tobacco and gasoline. There was no one else on board, but I felt an oppressive presence, as if unseen passengers filled the rows. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, the engines roared louder, and the plane began to taxi down a runway that didn't exist anymore. I rushed to the window. Outside, the airport was gone. Instead, I saw a barren field under a starless sky. No lights, no buildings, only endless darkness. A cold hand gripped my shoulder. I turned to see the man standing right behind me, his eyes full of sorrow. "We never left," he whispered. "Flight 501 crashed 50 years ago. We are trapped here, caught between the past and present." The plane shuddered violently, and the cabin lights flickered. I screamed, pounding on the door. Then everything went black. I woke up on the floor of the terminal, surrounded by concerned airport staff. The terminal was back to normal, bustling with travelers and workers. They told me I had fainted near gate D22. I looked around, but the gate I had boarded at was sealed off months ago, after a fatal crash had occurred on a flight bound for New Orleans decades earlier. Since that night, I avoid that terminal, that gate, and especially any late-night flights. Sometimes, when the airport is quiet and the lights flicker just so, I swear I see the man in the old suit standing near the window, waiting to board his eternal flight. Story the end.